Hello, I'm Dr. Lesley Sloss from the Clean Coal Centre, and I'm going to spend around 40 to 45 minutes telling you about my current draft report on the readiness of advanced coal-based power technologies. Now, I have been a presenter with the Clean Coal Centre for over 28 years. This is a draft review. It will be out shortly, probably within the next 3 to 4 weeks, and then the final version should be available on our website before the end of the year. The report summarises several state-of-the-art coal-to-power systems, giving an idea of where they are in terms of moving into commercial deployment. So the question is, are they running now? And if not, why not? What is needed to get them out into that available commercial market space? Now, the report covers all of the technologies listed on the left of this slide. These are all distinct processes and they are complex, but don't panic. The Clean Coal Centre has several detailed reports on each of these technologies, and these are full reports, most of which are available free as one-click downloads from the website. This report is more of an overview, summarising each of these and giving a snapshot of where they are now, focusing, as shown on the right, on the history, the current status, the challenges, both technological and economic, and the barriers to deployment. So, looking at HELE technologies, we can't really talk about advancements without mentioning this word HELE, that's high efficiency, low emissions technologies. These are the cleaner, more efficient, more advanced versions of the conventional coal-fired power plants of the past. And they, for the majority of them, are designed to be ready for carbon capture and storage as well. Now, the decision that's being made on whether to install coal generation, be it advanced or conventional, is made at a government level, and it's based on specific country needs. It's growing electricity demand, affordable options for electricity production, and the country's level of commitment to clean energy. For many emerging economies, cleaner power depends more on economics, resources and local expertise than it does in other more developed regions. So ideally, the state-of-the-art technologies discussed in this report should be made available as affordable, ideally modular or cut-and-paste options for these emerging regions to enable to make this technology leap into the near-zero emissions power sector. Many of these systems have been designed to work with low-grade, low-quality coals and in regions of water restriction, making them ideal for some of these developing and emerging regions. Now, as I say, the technologies reviewed in this report are not currently at fully commercial stage. They're all somewhere along this treacherous path from theory through demonstration to commercial deployment. Now, as shown in this diagram, there are two main areas where the path can lead into what's known as the Valley of Death, where some technologies just go to die, as you may put it. The first is just after the laboratory scale tests, where either the system doesn't work or it's going to be too problematic or too expensive for investors to take it any further. The second is the step up from pilot scale to full demonstration scale. Again, a period where the technology or the economic risks may be too high for investors and those working on the project. And the costs are not insignificant. When we're talking about lab, maybe around kilowatts up to a megawatt, it can be around $1 million for one of these projects. And taking that to pilot scale to 10 megawatts or more can be orders of magnitude more expensive. Theoretically, moving this all to demonstration scale should be just making a bigger version of the pilot plant, but we know that that's not quite that simple. Something will have gone wrong or not worked perfectly at pilot scale, and further developments will have to be made, and this will require further investment in time, energy, expertise, and of course money. And it's often the expense that sees the demise of these projects. So much so that the first few stages often rely on government funding. And it's only when we're moving to commercial and near commercial stage that people rely on investors from outside. And at that stage, it's when you need to convince these investors that this financial risk is justified. So in this report, I'm going to try and see where each of these technologies that we discuss appear along this pathway and what's needed to maybe nudge them further along. Excuse me. So in terms of conventional power, the days of atmospheric pressure combustion are largely of the past. Subcritical plants still out there running up to around an 34-35% efficiency. But state-of-the-art coal plants are being built supercritical or ultra supercritical, and these are heading up to 40–50% efficiency. This is a lovely slide created by Toby and Paul in our office based on the latest data on global plant efficiencies. Now, according to the Platts database, China leads with 226 ultra supercritical plants in operation. South Korea has 22 ultra supercritical, Japan 19, and Germany has 13, and there are quite a few more scattered in other countries. These are fully commercial and are providing clean combustion in many regions. In fact, I read last week, and I hope it's correct, that apparently by 2020, every single coal-fired power plant in China will be more efficient than every single coal-fired power plant in the USA. Obviously, that's kind of pickpocketing data and it's just a snapshot, but this is showing what's happening in a country such as China, which is choosing to phase out older subcritical plants and make all of the new fleet supercritical or ultra supercritical. The next step after this is to go to advanced ultra supercritical. However, then you have to look at the technologies. Supercritical and ultra supercritical are based on high pressure, high temperature steam cycles, and these require far advanced technologies in terms of turbines, in terms of the metal alloys that are used to be able to cope with these extreme conditions. And although we're moving towards advanced supercritical, there's a little bit more to be done to ensure that these technologies and these metals can cope with these advanced and extreme conditions. I do mention advanced ultra supercritical in the report. However, I'd rather move on to perhaps the more exciting and exotic technologies which are under development. So first of all, let's have a look at IGCC, that's Integrated Gasification Combined Cycle. Now, this diagram on the right summarizes the basic principle. Basically, coal in the middle there is in the combustion area. It's under pressure, often with limited oxygen. It can be run as an air-blown system, but as far as I can see, the majority of systems are oxygen-blown. So in order to get that oxygen, you have to have what's on the right there, the ASU, the air separation unit, to make sure that there's pure oxygen going into the plant. This also gives it a cleaner burn. There's no NOx produced because there's no NOx going into the boiler. This gasification process itself is going to release heat. That's going to follow that pathway down to the bottom there and produce heat through a steam turbine that can be converted into power via a generator, standard Rankine cycle. However, the gas produced from gasification can also be used, after being cleaned up, by being fed like a gas would into a combustion turbine, the Brayton cycle type approach. So you've got two separate cycles there. Over and above that, you've got any excess heat coming from the gas combustion turbine being fed to the steam combustion turbine. So you've got a very system with multiple cycles happening, hence the combined cycle title. Now, these systems can work with a wide range of coals, including low-quality coals and lignites, lower water usage than most conventional plants, and the gas that's produced at the end is relatively clean and suitable for a little bit of processing to get it ready for carbon capture and utilization or storage. And so IGCC is a very tempting HELE technology. At the moment, it's only just moving into full-scale demonstration. However, it still features quite heavily in the technology roadmap of several countries. For example, this is Japan. Now, the graph here shows ultra supercritical coal plants along the bottom there in that lime green, sitting at around 42 to 47% efficiency, that increasing over time as the technology develops. Then there's the move towards IGCC, which we're moving into now, could take that efficiency to up to and over 50–55%. And finally, I move towards IGFC, that's Integrated Gasification Fuel Cell, that I'm going to talk about in a minute. Now, I'm not presenting this as a summary of the efficiencies of these plants of the technology. It's here just to demonstrate the faith being placed in the successful deployment of these technologies into the future in some of these countries. Quite a lot of heavy reliance on these working and a lot of optimism that they will do so. The report that I produce covers all of the IGCC plants that I know, but I've only included a few of them here as they won't all fit into one slide. So what I've done is to perhaps choose the most notable projects. The early demonstrations, the Boegenum in the Netherlands and the Puertolano, they didn't work fully, they were closed, they produced a lot of information, but they were closed down as nobody was prepared to take them to a sort of full-scale commercial plant. However, they produced an awful lot of information on which the following projects were based. However, the majority of demonstrations have proven expensive and problematic. Perhaps the most notable would be the notorious Kemper County plant that's in the USA. This was a 580 megawatt project that ran 7 years late and ended up costing twice the projected amount. The plant is currently now being converted to fire and natural gas, as gas is cheaper and more effective in this scenario. Similarly, Wabash River, also in the USA, has switched to chemical production rather than staying with coal. It had trialled various coals, low-quality coals and low petroleum coke, but it had trouble with reduced plant availability, fouling and corrosion, as well as some other technical issues. There are operational IGCC plants in the Czech Republic, and the Eagle project in Japan and GreenGen project in China are both based on IGCC technology. So this is a list now of under development plans, so plants moving into the proposed or developmental stage. A quick scan of that sort of first column on the left here shows that the majority, if not all of these plants, are currently delayed or on hold. Of the 20 IGCC projects proposed in 2013 for China, only 3 appear to be moving further towards development. And so IGCC had some teething issues. It does seem to work. We have some plants working, but hardly anyone is building any new plants. So why? What is this hold up with IGCC? On the right there, we can see the summary of what the commercial companies are doing right now with their research and development. They're focusing on reducing the cost, on making it suitable for low-grade coals, and customizing solutions to specific issues. So these countries are still very heavily invested in making this technology work. On the right hand, I've listed the sort of general technology needs. We need advanced air separation units to get that oxygen for the combustion zone. These systems are available. They're a little bit expensive, and more importantly, perhaps, there can be a significant drain on the auxiliary power, 10 to 15% of that. So that makes running these plants continue to be more expensive than running an expensive plant. We also need gasifier systems to be upgraded, systems for hot gas cleanup, anything to do with reducing corrosion and wear is good, and of course advancement in turbines. Any advancement in a turbine is going to make any plant and all plants cheaper to run and more efficient. So IGCC is expensive and it's complex ski. Most of the plants ran over budget and over time, and even the most successful units continue to run at 15 to 20% more expensive than a conventional pulverized coal plant. And this means that the payback for the initial investment will be a long time coming unless there are available carbon credits or some other credit of some kind. And I guess this is what's not reading well on a project proposal spreadsheet. So from what I've reviewed so far, the consensus appears to be that IGCC should work, and it does work, but that it's expensive and complex. Because several plants have stalled or switched to other fuels, there is hesitancy amongst some investors. And possibly until the carbon capture and utilisation challenge is met, other advantages of IGCC are often considered not sufficient enough to offset this increased cost and risk. So if we look at the valley of death stage, it would appear that the technologies and the projects in the USA haven't made it through that second valley or kind of sitting at the bottom of that second valley. And this is largely due to the withdrawal of government funding, although the low gas prices also played a role in the demise of some of the US projects. However, conversely, and perhaps more enthusiastically and excitingly, Asia, China and Japan are still very keen on making IGCC work and have these cogen and green gen projects under development at the moment. They're working to make these plants efficient, to make them work, and so that they can fire more challenging coals. They then hope to move them on through further advanced iterations, such as fuel cells, into the IGFC that I'm going to talk about in a minute. They're also really putting CCUS into these proposed development lifetime scales as well. And so it seems that the Asian IGCC investment could help to pull this technology out of the valley of death and into commercialized availability, which could be uptake in other regions. Okay, switching tack now, we're moving to polygeneration, which is a sort of variation on the gasification system we've just spoken about. So again, we have a zone where we're gasifying coal. It can be pressurized, fluidized bed, air blown, oxide blown, whatever you like. But what's happening there is basically gasification. And again, at the bottom there, you can be feeding that into a steam cycle with a steam turbine, or perhaps into a gas turbine under a abrasion cycle. So you're producing power, but at the same time, along the top there, you're taking some of the syngas and you're producing chemicals or liquid fuels or gas fuels for other means. So it's producing two things at the same time, polygeneration. These plants can be very efficient, 55 to 60% efficient, and can use a wide range of fuels, including some waste and other materials. They offer flexibility over basic gasification systems, obviously, because you can be producing power and chemicals at the same time, and you can fluctuate between those depending on the price of the demand for each. Now, with this in mind, you would think that these polygeneration plants would be popular and widely deployed, but that's not the case. They just seem to be just that little bit too complicated. And as far as I can see, there aren't really any polygeneration plants in operation. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I know there are a couple in China, the Yongquan and the Jiangxi Luan plants in China, which are defined as coal-to-chemical plants, but they use some of the waste heat for heat and electricity production. I'm not sure that I regard that as a fully polygeneration plant, but I'm open to discussion on that. If anyone has further information, please send it to me. So from what I can see, as I say, many polygeneration plants have been proposed, but few have been built. I mean, the GreenGen project in China and the EAGLE projects in Japan, which are IGCC projects, started out being proposed as polygeneration systems, but they both decided to stick with just producing power. It's not dead yet, though. There's quite a lot of interest in polygeneration, bit of a buzz going on in Europe at the moment. For example, there's this proposed FABIENE project in Germany, as shown here. They're currently working on sort of pilot and small-scale demonstration, but they're more focused on sort of modelling what will happen and focusing on the potential output in the plants in terms of economic evaluation. So looking at three things as shown on the left there: the cost and the complexity of the plant itself, the available market for the electricity they produce, and the market for the chemicals they produce. And what they've done is kind of on the right there is put a little map of how things are going with respect to current pricing for carbon, for methanol, and so on. And the X in the middle there shows that in the current situation, a methanol plant alone would be far more economically viable than anything producing power. So although it offers the potential to produce both power and chemicals, investors are going to look at that and say, well, if we're going to make more money out of methanol, let's just produce methanol. There are other projects considered elsewhere. Toruń in Poland are also going through the same sort of process, where they're planning to build a plant but are doing the pre-modelling stage to work out economics. Pakistan is talking about polygeneration, and since Pakistan needs both chemicals and power with a great amount of need, this could be where polygeneration works really well. However, you're then taking in a very complex plant with operation and constructional issues to an area such as Pakistan with little experience, so that could be a challenge there as well. So moving on to the polygeneration dilemma as I see it, you've got gasification technologies to produce power. They're complex and expensive. And you've got coal to liquids or coal to X plants, which are also complex and expensive. And by putting those together, you're ending up with an even more complex and even more expensive plant. And when it comes down to it, there's going to be one of these products that is going to make more money than the other, and any investor is going to focus on that. And I think that is why these projects have always ended up going down one route or the other. That's not to say polygeneration won't eventually find a way or a home. It's just going to have to find the right market. And as far as I can see, the right market's going to have readily available coal supply, an energy market which is going to reward dispatchable power, so you get more money for power that's on demand, as it were, but also a chemical market that's prepared to pay enough for you to produce chemicals, but is not going to be totally reliant on that, and the demand's not going to be too high, but it's also going to be demand that is still there should you produce chemicals, and that is a very niche window of opportunity there. Over and above this, unless CO2 or usage or credits come into play, polygeneration is going to find it hard to become economically viable as well. Okay, you're still with me, I hope. We're going to move swiftly on to oxy-fuel combustion now. Another complicated slide, but as I said, we have full reports on each of these technologies that you can read at your leisure and with slightly less scary speed that I'm going at the moment. Now, this is oxy-fuel combustion with CO2 processing there. Oxygen is produced again from that ASU, the air separation unit at the top there. That's going to feed into the boiler on the left to give clean combustion. And at the same time, the flue gas is cleaned at the bottom. Some of that flue gas is fed through your CPU, the CO2 processing unit, for carbon capture and utilization. And at the same time, some of the flue gas is going to be fed back into the boiler. So you've got a sort of cycling system there going with a clean burn. There have been over 15 small-scale and pilot demonstrations carried out since 1980. However, as this table shows, despite several demonstration plants having been proposed, none has really made it to full-scale demonstration or has remained in operation. For the UK and the USA, the failure to proceed with the project seems to be largely due to the funding, mostly due to the withdrawal of support for carbon capture-related research, as far as we can see. For the Chinese plant, the issue is reported to be more to do with the perceived risk of the project. But there is a recent move by the US Department of Energy to prove that oxy-fuel combustion is still a very possible and viable new HELE contender. They have a new project starting this year, which could lead to a 50-megawatt demonstration plant. The US Department of Energy are going to be mentioned quite a bit in the remainder of this report and in this talk because they have been consistently supportive of investing in new clean coal options. So there I've given details, Combustilia, the White Rose Project, FutureGen. Again, I'm not going to go into detail here, but the report will give you more detail as to why each of those either crashed and burned or is sitting in a sort of delay zone. So looking at the cost of oxy-fuel combustion, which seems to be one of the bones of contention as to why it's not commercial as yet. It seems to be the added expense of these two big bolt-on systems, that is the gas processing systems, the ASU, the air separation unit, and the CPU, the carbon dioxide processing unit. These are big, they are hefty, they are expensive, but they're not stupidly expensive. It seems to be the issue is that running these adds to the running cost and the operation and maintenance of any plant. So they're an expense that remains after the build, and they add to the overall running costs of the plant. We're working to make these systems more efficient and so on, but until that happens, that is a significant chunk of the cost of the oxy-fuel systems. And at the moment, because of that, they don't appear to offer a clear economic advantage over any other system that could otherwise pop on just a tail-end carbon capture and storage system. So at the moment, they're not, as far as I can see, tempting with respect to the economics. So based again on the historical literature I've looked at in this report, oxy-fuel technology appears to have hit one of those valleys of death in the development curve. And a lot of the UK projects are kind of stuck at the bottom, waiting for more money to carry them out there. And it seems that the USA is the only one doing that. They're spending $3.3 million on a pilot plant based on pressurized oxy-fuel combustion. It's currently conceptual, and the first phase is going to be looking at the detailed design, the specification, the cost and construction, sort of planning out what the combustion pilot plant will look at. And then the next stage will actually be building that 10-megawatt pilot scale project. And the eyes of the world are going to be upon that project, as it could be make or break for oxy-fuel development. Swiftly on, we're now going to be looking at supercritical CO2 in the Allam cycle. I hope you're still with me. Another scary slide. Supercritical CO2, I'm going to make this probably more simple than it is, but in order to get through this quickly, we're going to have to simplify it. Supercritical CO2 is CO2 at a critical temperature and pressure, which is 7.4 megapascals and 31 degrees centigrade. And at that temperature and pressure, it acts simultaneously as a liquid and gas, which is really quite exciting. It's also stable, abundant, inexpensive, non-flammable, and less corrosive than water. So it's really good for running a turbine. So that means instead of steam in a typical Rankine cycle, you've got this supercritical CO2 gas turning the turbines. So with that, now that we have that, there are two different, or there are more than two, but let's just look at the main two supercritical CO2 cycles. These are the indirect cycle, where the CO2 loop in that turbine gets closed off. The CO2 is being heated and cooled through the primary heat exchanger with the heat coming from the boiler. But that boiler and the flue gases coming out of that boiler are not mixing with the CO2 in the turbine. On the right, we have the direct or the semi-closed supercritical CO2 cycle. And again, this has a loop of CO2 going around the turbine, but some of that CO2 can be coming from the combustion plant itself. Okay? As I say, more detailed reports are available, especially an excellent one produced recently by Chen Zhu. So if you want to know more about the technology, go and have a look at that. Now, the buzz at the moment appears to be around not just the supercritical CO2, but this Allam cycle, which is a very specific supercritical CO2 cycle designed within the last 10 to 20 years. There's a lot of buzz about it, a lot of interest. It's really quite complicated, so I'm going to have to read this out so that we both understand where we are. The CO2 supercritical is produced from natural gas at this moment in time and being fired with pure oxygen under pressure. So it's an OXYFUEL combustion system with gas to produce this clean flue gas. And this pressurized supercritical CO2 stream is then being used to drive the turbine, as I've said before. It's then recycled. The gas is reheated, repressurized, and recirculated in a semi-closed loop. And so the Allam cycle, the single turbine, is driven only by water and carbon dioxide due to pure oxygen being used as the combustion gas. So it's one of these loops where the CO2 is coming from the cleaner combustion in the OXYFUEL combustion area. I know it's a lot on one slide. I do apologize. Now, Allam cycle at the moment only works with natural gas. So if we're going to take this one step further and make it work with coal, then you're going to be talking about bolting on a gasification plant to produce the syngas that would feed into the Allam cycle. And that, of course, is quite complicated. As we know, we're working through IGCC and POLYGENERATION. We can do gasification, but getting that gas clean enough to feed into an Allam system is going to be the challenge. Either that gas has to be super clean before it's fed in, or the Allam cycle combustion area is going to have to be modified so that it can cope with gasified coal, which can be a little bit more toxic and damaging than the cleaner natural gas cycle. Now, once again, it's the US Department of Energy that is leading the way in the investment and development of projects in supercritical CO2 and the Allam cycle. They have been focusing initially on components and materials. They're not going to build a plant until they know that they have the materials that can cope with the high pressures and temperatures that's going to be met. So they're investing, 30 million was invested in 2016, and a further 80 million has been awarded to the SWRI project in Texas. This is part of the STEP program, that's a Supercritical Transformation Electric Power program, which was launched in 2017 to build the world's first supercritical CO2 plant. And as I say, before they move into construction, they're going to be looking at focusing on turbo machinery, recuperators, and so on. The first Allam cycle demonstration plant, funded by the USDOE, is going to be built in La Porte in Texas. It's going to be a 50 megawatt thermal or 25 megawatt electric plant using natural gas. And it will run potentially a net efficiency of 58.9%. I'll say that again, 58.9%, compare with conventional subcritical at 30 to 35 and IGCC between 45, possibly 50 at the moment. So this is 58.9, this could be huge. And even if we have carbon capture on that plant, it will drop to 51.4% efficiency, still above anything we have available at the moment. If the demonstration phase of this La Porte is successful, they plan to expand to 295 megawatt demonstration plant, a cost of 140 million, and they're actually hoping that that will be operational by 2020, which is very soon. And as shown in this timeline here, they're aiming for global deployment of 300 megawatt commercial systems as early as 2021, somewhere between 20 and 25. And that is a huge aim, so they must have a lot of faith in the work that they're doing at the moment. So the important thing to note about supercritical CO2 cycles is that for the closed-loop systems where you've just got CO2 going round and round in a turbine, the source of that heat is immaterial. You could put it on a nuclear plant, on a renewable plant, on an industrial plant, providing efficient, cleaner power in a more compact way. It could revolutionise the power industry, reducing costs by 15%. However, obviously adding that to coal and gas is going to be good for the cleaning up the coal sector as well. Now, the biggest challenge is going to be the advanced recuperative gas turbines and the heat exchangers. The gas turbines, they're going to have to cope with the supercritical CO2 and the heat exchangers to make sure that there's no heat loss as the gases move throughout this complex system. Now, these systems apparently are not quite currently technically available, but as we can see, the DOE has a lot of expertise, and they believe that the skills are available to have these technologies going within this tight US DOE time frame. It's not going to be an insignificant challenge, but hopefully they're going to get there. Okay, another change of stead. We're going to move into stationary fuel cells now. These are quite distinct from the other systems we've discussed. The previous systems we were talking about combustion. Fuel cells are not combustion-based, okay? They produce electricity chemically through oxidation. They therefore have the potential to produce power very effectively and could be up to 90% efficient if we're talking about combined heat and power. They're very clean. They have minimal pollutant emissions to the atmosphere, consume significantly less water than a power plant. They can be produced in small modular units, which can be stacked to make a bigger unit, so that makes them ideal for shipping out to remote places individually and then popping them all together to make a big power plant once you've got them there. Now, gas-fired fuel cells are commercially available. You can buy them. Big companies such as Google are using them. However, they're small, they're complex, and they're very expensive, and they have their own challenges with respect to durability and reliability. So fuel cells are like batteries. They require the movement of molecules and electrons to work. And currently, the fuel cell market is based on systems which work with gaseous fuels. Coal, as we know, is not a gas. And when it's turned into a gas, it's not initially a clean gas. So the first fuel cells that are being developed at the moment plan to use gasified coal. So there is further significant investment required in those hot gas cleanup systems that I've mentioned. So this is referring back to the slide I said earlier, where we have the CoolGen and the CleanGen projects in China, currently investing in IGCC, but hoping to move those into IGFC within the next 10 to 15 years. So what would be happening there is that you're taking your IGCC plant, you're gasifying your coal, you're cleaning it, and then you're feeding that clean syngas into a fuel cell situation. The first demonstration plants of these IGFCs are going to be operational theoretically or hopefully in Asia by 2020, as I say, building upon the current IGCC projects out there. But obviously this won't happen unless these initial IGCC projects are successful. So somewhere between the next 10 to 15 years, we may see these things up and running, and this would be a huge leap forward in the development of clean coal technologies. This is the roadmap. Again, the State Department and the US Department of Energy investing a lot in all clone technologies, including solid oxide fuel cells and other fuel cell-based systems. At the moment, the R&D efforts over there are focusing on electrochemical performance and the durability of these cells. These cells don't tend to last long. They need to improve power density and robustness, stop degradation, and basically, of course, get those costs down so that they're affordable. If we move back to I think the next slide is, yes, just the conclusion, sorry. The IEACCC CoolGen in Japan and GreenGen in China, as I say, are currently IGCC development projects. They are hoping, once they've proved them to work, to switch them on into IGFC systems, a significant technology leap. Now, I didn't mention DFC, that's direct coal fuel cells, because these are still at the developmental stage. In fact, they're still at bench scale and theoretical stage. They're discussed very quickly in the report, but they're going to take an awful lot longer to work in practice. In order to use coal or solid fuel or sort of mobile solid fuel within a fuel, you're going to have to clean up that coal significantly. So you're talking about processing out ash, sulfur, and trace elements, and that's going to add a significant level of processing and related costs. So we don't see DCFC systems coming into the radar for another 10 years, at least, I shouldn't think. Okay, another technical issue. I hope you're still with me. We're going to look quickly at chemical looping now. It's a bit like fuel cells in that it's not combustion, it's oxidation that's happening. And in this situation, though, it's two fluidized beds sort of sat next to each other. So you've got an air reactor on the right that's producing oxygen, and then you've got a fuel reactor, on the left, and fuel reactor on the right. Now what happens is the oxygen in the air is sort of attached onto these little carrier molecules, which tend to be iron, nickel, copper, or similar material. And that oxygen is then carried through the fuel reactor where the oxygen oxidizes the fuel. And then these metals circle back through. So you've got a looping system and a chemical looping system. When the fuel is oxidized, as in other systems, heat is produced and that is turned into power. That is an extreme oversimplification of the system. Again, go and see Chen's report if you want, Singh's report if you want more information. But that's the crux of it. It's cycling of oxygen through plant via a chemical means. Still at the theoretical stage, could be moving towards a 10 megawatt demonstration within the next decade. So we're not expecting it to be commercial within the next few years. The most promising system seems to be the high PR ring process being developed in Japan, and there also, as you might guess, a US Department of Energy project, a direct looping demonstration project being developed at Dover Light and Power in Ohio, which hopes to be at 10 megawatt electric by 2020, which is pretty soon. So I think we're on the last one. People. This is quite an easy one to say for the end. It's not that technical. A hybrid system is simply a system where you're using two separate forms of power together to increase the efficiency of one or both. So it's not like co-firing where you're firing biomass with coal. It's when these systems are still separate. So, for example, that picture on the right there was a demonstration run at Little Power in New South Wales, where you can see the solar array, and the heat from those photovoltaic cells was used to heat the feed water going into the coal-fired power plant on the left, and that offset some of the energy requirements and increased the efficiency of the plant by a few percentage points. So I don't want to go into the technical stuff of this because it really is simply putting one thing next to another. What I'd like to do is put across this report, this review I came across just last month by Chen and others, which looks at the potential for using hybrid systems in China. It looks at the locations of the coal plants, the chemical plants, renewable systems, nuclear plants, plus the potential for further wind and solar deployment across the country. I'm summarising this quite brutally, I'm sorry, but the results are really quite interesting. What they found is that the integration of solar, wind and natural gas with coal would be very suitable to the northwest of China. Coal and biomass integration would be best in east and central areas, and the eastern coast would be best for the integration of nuclear, wind and coal. So they looked at what they've got and how they can link it together. And by doing so, they've shown that they can get significant CO2 reductions by linking these things. It's a very interesting proposal, and it's very unlikely that the government is actually going to run with it in the foreseeable future. But it's certainly something to be considered, especially in emerging economies, where you could be planning the position and the situation of your coal-fired plants, your renewable energies, and your chemical plants. And there are ways of citing these together so that they can have some sort of feed-in to a mutually beneficial scenario, if you understand what I'm saying. Now, hybrid systems technically ready. I mean, photovoltaics are ready, coal plants are definitely ready. But it's like polygeneration. Everything's ready to go, but does the economics actually work? It's going to be very site and very case specific. Hybrid plants combine renewable energy with coal. And so they're going to have the same limitations as most renewable systems. They will be intermittent and they're going to have issues with weather and location and so on. The most feasible hybrid option that seems to have come across so far is the combination of solar power with coal, this offsetting of the heat for the feed water being provided by the power or the heat coming from the solar panels. It's been shown to be technically feasible in several full-scale demonstrations, but it doesn't seem to be there's no uptake of it at this stage, and presumably that's because it's more of an economic or a logistical issue than a technical one. Perhaps when the cost of photovoltaic cells comes down, the combination of coal with solar might be more tempting to investors. Okay, so I think we're nearly done. Yes, we're heading towards conclusions. Okay, as promised, Here's my little map of the development curve. Now, it's not finished. As I say, the report is not going to be out in draft for a couple of weeks, so I'm still shifting these little arrows around. And if you want to help me move an arrow, if you think it's the wrong place, please do email me as soon as you can, and we can discuss this through. So what I'm seeing, if we go from sort of most deployable to least deployable, IGCC, as we know, CoolGen and Osaki PowerGen, all these are being built in Japan and China. They are seen as important parts of the future energy mix in these regions. And China is investing in IGCC, over 180 projects proposed over there. So if China can get the rest of us sort of out of this curve and up off into full-scale demonstration, then that is what's going to happen. It's going to be Asia that pulls the rest of the world into accepting IGCC as commercially available. Next down the list, we have the polygeneration. As I said, it's pretty much ready to roll. But it is technically complex, and it's this complexity and the economics of the plant that seems to be the stalling point. When it comes down to putting the plan for the plant on paper, there's always one that's going to make more money. Either the chemicals are going to make more money or the power is going to make more money, and that, as far as I can see, is what the investors see. They see that if it's going to make more money being a chemical plant, then that's that. The flexibility adds additional cost and complexity that might not be rewarded in long-term operation. Solar hybrid is next down that list there. As I just said, it's technically available. It's bolting two things that already work next to each other. That success, like polygeneration, is going to be site and case specific, depending on the availability of the fuel mixes and the potential markets. The cost for renewable energy would need to come down for coal-fired power plants to consider bolting these things on, and CO2 prices could also help there as well. Next down there at the kind of bottom of the, at the bottom of the curve that heading back out is the Allam Cycle and the supercritical CO2. And I put it there because it's quite exciting, and it seems to me that because it's relatively new, and it seems in principle to be likely to work. A lot of people are heavily investing in it, and they believe that it will be commercially available and running within the next 10 years, possibly less. There are significant advancements required in turbines and heat recovery systems, as I've said before, to cope with these supercritical CO2 systems. But these gas cleaning challenges and turbine challenges are familiar to all of the other technologies that use turbines. Everybody needs better turbines. Everybody needs better heat recovery. Everybody could benefit from stronger components and metals, alloys. So there is a sort of joint research that is going to benefit each of these, and the Allam Cycle and the investment there is going to feed into knowledge that will benefit IGCC and other areas. Down there at the bottom there, I put OXYFUEL down a sort of in a stalled zone, because we know that majority of plants have indeed stalled due to the costs and the complexity of these plants. However, we do know that the US Department of Energy is kicking some funding in there, a new demonstration plant which may well lift that OXYFUEL to the other side of that valley of death there. IGFC systems, that's way back down that curve there, they're going to sit there and wait, but as soon as those IGCC systems up the top there, as soon as those start working in Japan and China and things move over, they could pass through that second valley of death quite quickly, or perhaps the technology won't work and they will die. We'll just need to wait and see. They're a little bit further to go there. At the tail end, there are two there. There's the direct carbon fuel cells, which I've told you are still at bench scale, not there yet. There's also MHD, which is magnetohydrodynamics, which I mentioned very briefly in the report. I'm not going to talk about here. Basically, it's the same level as CFC. It's all on paper and nothing practical as. So, as I say, that's where I think things are. For different reasons on these Valley of Death curves, I would be more than happy to hear from you if you think you have a better suggestion as where they should be on that curve. So, to conclude, there are common technical barriers. These air separation systems for oxy-fuel combustion, anything requiring purified O2 to go into a boiler, those air separation systems take up a lot of power. And gas handling systems, both before and after combustion, hot gas cleanup systems, and the CO2 processing units. A lot of investment is required there to get the costs down and those things working. Materials for higher temperatures and pressures, both in turbines and in combustion zones. Turbines that work better, you cannot lose by making your turbine more efficient and more stable. Heat exchangers is also a no-brainer. If you can get more power out and lose less heat, then your plant's going to become more efficient. So in terms of what needs to happen in terms of perhaps more economic or more idiosyncratic approaches, then we're talking about moving people's vision of how they're going to accept these new technologies. Now, emerging economies will often only pay for HELE technologies which are more expensive if they receive funding or if they're legally obliged to due to tightening emission standards. So a move towards CO2 credits or some other financial pricing mechanism for CO2 would be useful because majority of the topics and the technologies I discussed are carbon capture ready. And so that would give them perhaps an economic advantage that could lift them into a selection to make them affordable, or more affordable certainly than they are now. And further, energy prices and tariffs could reward this plank's flexibility and efficiency. A little bit of help in the economics or the feed-in tariffs for these new projects would help them make their money back sooner and would help the development and the passage of these plants through that pathway towards deployment and out of those valleys of death. Now, I've spoken very quickly. My mouth is extremely dry at this stage. I hope I've presented everything well. It was a very complex report. As I say, it's not finished yet. I am more than happy to hear your opinions, your suggestions. Send me more data, and I'm more than happy to put in there. I do not have time for questions right now. I am sorry, and there are quite a few here. I apologise. What I'm going to do is answer each and every one of those individually, and hopefully at the same time I can get more information out of you that will be useful for my final report. Thanks again for bearing with me through that. It was hard going, but hopefully it gives you an idea of where we are in terms of these fantastic new HELE technologies. Thank you very much.